In the winter of 1869, in a curtained room on Washington Place, the richest man in America sat at a small table and waited for the dead to speak. Cornelius Vanderbilt held a fortune people said was larger than the money in the United States Treasury, and he had come to hear his dead son and his dead mother. He was not the only one. A distinguished New York lawyer would sign away his marble mansion to a woman who told him the old masters were painting for him from beyond the grave. A widowed heiress would pour a fortune into a mystic and die still believing, 2 weeks before they broke open his cellar floor and found what was really down there. A rifle heiress would raise the strangest house in America, room after room, for almost 40 years. Behind every one of these fortunes was a grave and a voice that promised to reach it. Who grows rich when the richest people alive cannot buy back the one thing they have lost? If you love the Gilded Age the way I do, its glamour and its ghosts both, then subscribe and stay close, because I am going to take you into 5 true stories of enormous money and unbearable loss, and the mediums who stood in the doorway between them. Chapter 1. A marketplace built on graves. The dead had never been so busy, nor so profitable, as they became in America in the years after the guns of the Civil War fell silent. It began, as these things often do, with 2 young girls and a sound. In the spring of 1848, in a small rented farmhouse at Hydesville in upstate New York, the Fox sisters, Kate and Maggie, still children, reported knocking sounds in the walls of their bedroom, and a code by which the knocks would answer questions, a rap for yes, silence for no. It should have died there, a children's prank in a country farmhouse. Instead, it caught like fire in dry grass. Within a year, the sisters were filling halls in Rochester. Within a decade, they had helped set loose a movement that claimed followers in the millions on both sides of the Atlantic, a faith with no church and no scripture and no God but memory, built on a single irresistible promise. Not that the dead were at peace, but that the dead could be reached. To understand why that promise fell on such hungry ground, you have to understand how much death there was. The war that ended in 1865 had killed more than 600,000 young men, and later counts pushed the figure higher still, toward 750,000, out of a country a fraction of the size it is now. Whole towns had sent their sons south and buried empty uniforms, and that was only the visible slaughter. Beneath it ran the ordinary, ceaseless dying of the age, the fevers that took children in a week, the consumption that hollowed a husband out over a single winter, the infants who simply failed to thrive and were gone before their names were worn smooth by use. Nearly every household in the country had a small grave in it somewhere. Into that vast, aching silence the mediums spoke, and they said the one thing every grieving person on earth most wants to hear. Your beloved is not gone. Your beloved is in the next room. Step to the door, and I will open it for you. It was a doorway, and it is worth seeing it as one before we go any further, because the image will follow us through every story in this film. Grief is a door that a great fortune cannot close. You may own railroads and marble palaces and a name that stops traffic on 5th Avenue. And still there is a room in the house of your life whose door will not shut, and behind it stands the person you have lost. The medium was the figure who appeared in that doorway, holding a candle, promising a single glimpse of what lay beyond, and asking, very gently, for a fee. These are not stories about foolish people. They are stories about the most powerful people in the country discovering the one thing their power could not do, and the marketplace that formed at once around that discovery. For the rich grieved exactly as the poor did. They simply had so much more to give. The movement drew them from the top of society downward, and it drew in people no one could dismiss as simple. a Boston photographer named William Mumler sold portraits of the living with a lost face floating pale behind them, and one of his most famous images showed the widow of a murdered president, with the pale shadow of Abraham Lincoln standing behind her. Grieving first ladies filled the private rooms of the White House with mediums. Later, the parents of a dead railroad heir would sit in darkened Paris hotels and San Francisco parlors trying to reach a lost 15-year-old son. And out of that grief would come a great university. Mediumship gave women, above all, a strange new authority, for a woman who fell into a trance and spoke could hold a room full of powerful men in an age that allowed her almost no other public voice. And so the great mediums of the century were very often women, and their most devoted patrons very often the bereaved and the rich. The whole vast enterprise rested on trust, and the trust was never entirely safe. In time, even one of the Fox sisters, the very children who had started it all, would stand on a stage before a paying crowd and confess that the famous rappings had been nothing but the cracking of the joints of her own toes. And still, the belief did not die, because the need beneath it could not die. A confession could kill a trick. It could not kill a grief. What follows are 5 of the people that need reached at the very summit of American wealth, told in the order of how much each of them finally surrendered to it. We begin with the man who had the most of anyone in the country to lose, and who wanted only what the poorest widow in the land wanted, which was to hear again a voice that was gone. Chapter 2. The richest man wants his mother. Cornelius Vanderbilt could buy a railroad with a signature, and he could not buy back the 2 people he wanted most. That is the whole of him, in a sentence, and everything else is only detail. He had been born on a Staten Island farm in the last years of the 1700s, and he had clawed his way up from a single small ferry boat in the harbour to a fortune without equal on the continent. They called him the Commodore. He built his money in 3 great waves. First came the steamships, where rival lines paid him $40,000 a month, and then $56,000 a month, simply to abandon the routes he threatened to undercut, so that men found it cheaper to bribe him than to fight him. Then came the railroads, the New York and Harlem, the Hudson River Line, and the Great New York Central, which he gathered into a single iron empire running the length of a growing nation. The numbers around him stopped meaning anything ordinary. In 1873, near the end, he gave $1 million to found a university in the South, then the largest single charitable gift America had ever seen, and it barely dented him. When he died, his estate was reckoned at something on the order of $100 million, a sum said to rival the whole of the United States Treasury. People said, with a kind of shiver, that a single old man on Washington Place now controlled a sum close to $1 in every 9 circulating in the entire country. He had more money than some nations, and almost none of the softness that money is supposed to buy. For he was hard, profane, barely lettered, and nearly without sentiment in any matter of business. He once wrote to a pair of former partners who had crossed him a note that has never been bettered for cold economy. "You have undertaken to cheat me," he told them. "I will not sue you, for the law is too slow. I will ruin you." And he did. "There is no friendship in trade," he liked to say. He said of himself, near the end of his life, that he had been insane on the subject of money-making all his life. Hold that sentence close. It is his own, and it will come back at the very end of this film, when we stand in the wreckage of everything the money could not do. He had frightened a nation of businessmen. In his prime, he had run a steamship empire that reached from New York down to Nicaragua and out to California in the years of the gold rush, and he had learned that a rival was often cheaper bought than beaten. He answered to no board and asked no one's leave. And yet for all of that hardness, or perhaps because of it, the men closest to him saw something else underneath in his last years, a loneliness that his money seemed only to deepen, a widower rattling around a great house, outliving the people he had loved. Because there was a room in the Commodore's life whose door would not close, and two people stood behind it. The first was his mother, Phoebe Hand, a shrewd and iron-willed woman to whom he had been bound his entire life, and who died in 1854. The second was his son George, the boy he had chosen out of all his many children to inherit the name and the empire, a young man trained as a soldier at West Point, into whom the old man had poured every hope he had. George fell ill during the war and died without ever seeing a battlefield, and something in his father never healed. Here was the cruelty at the heart of it. Vanderbilt had 12 living children and grieved most for the dead one. He had a fortune beyond the dreams of kings and could not buy back a single hour of the boy's life. And so, quietly, in the years after the war, the hardest man in America went looking for a door. He found the people who said they could open it. He consulted clairvoyants and mediums, not for grief alone, but for guidance in business. And he carried his aches and his ailments to magnetic healers who laid their hands and their magnets upon his body and promised to draw the sickness out. There are stories, harder to prove and best held lightly, of an early spiritualist advisor on Staten Island paid handsome sums to drive troublesome ghosts out of his house, a boy killed under a horse, a workman killed on the line. What is beyond dispute is that the pattern was fixed and deep. He told one woman that a certain fortune teller had told him strange things and was a wonderful woman. He asked another, a magnetic healer named Jenny Danforth, to reach across to his first wife, Sophia, who had died in the summer of 1868. Danforth reported back that Sophia's spirit was, in her exact phrase, in a very distressed state. And the old man, who had crushed rivals without a flicker of feeling, is said to have answered that in that case he would certainly have to make another will. Picture it. The richest man in America, sitting in a shuttered room, taking instruction about the disposition of the greatest fortune on the continent from a voice he could not see. He had everything the world could sell. He had come to the one counter where his money bought him nothing but the sound of what he most longed to hear. And into that shuttered room, in the autumn of 1868, walked two sisters who would carry the séance table all the way to the floor of Wall Street. Chapter 3. The spirits pick his stocks. A woman told him the spirits guided her hand upon the market, and the richest man in America opened his purse. Her name was Victoria Woodhull, and her sister was Tennessee Claflin, called Tenny, and they arrived in Vanderbilt's life about a month after his first wife died, when he was 74, and they were young, magnetic, and entirely unafraid of him. They had been raised on the road by a huckster father who sold them from town to town as clairvoyant healers, advertising themselves plainly as magnetic physicians who charged $25 in advance for a sitting, and they had learned to read a wealthy and lonely man the way the Commodore read a balance sheet. Tenny became his personal magnetic healer, laying her hands on the old man, and she became a fixture of the house on Washington Place through the winter and the spring, a warm and willing presence in a cold and lonely widowerhood. He is said to have called her his little sparrow. His own physician remarked, not unkindly, that the old man was often childish now, and lucky to have so attractive and willing a companion to soothe him. There were whispers of a good deal more than healing between them, and even, some said, of a proposal of marriage the Commodore made, and Tenny refused. But the sisters offered him more than the laying on of hands. They offered him tips. Victoria let it be understood that the spirits whispered to her which way the market would break, that a robed presence had first appeared to her as a girl and spelled out on a marble tabletop the name of the ancient Greek orator Demosthenes, who guided her still. The Commodore, who already believed the dead could speak, was more than ready to believe they could also trade. Acting on what she told him, the sisters built a fund of almost $700,000 in 6 weeks, and around the great gold panic of the autumn of 1869, the first day the newspapers would ever call Black Friday, they came out ahead while other men were ruined. With that money, in February of 1870, they threw open the doors of the brokerage house of Woodhull, Claflin and Company at 44 Broad Street, the first firm in the history of Wall Street run by women. The crowds thronged the pavement outside from early morning until late at night, come to gape at the impossible sight, and the newspapers, half scornful and half dazzled, christened them the bewitching brokers and the queens of finance. A few months later, the sisters launched a weekly paper of their own that would champion the vote for women and free love and spiritualism all at once, that would one day print the first American edition of a pamphlet by a German exile named Karl Marx, and that would light the fuse on the greatest sex scandal of the age. Behind the whole dazzling enterprise, never once admitting it in public, stood the money and the name of Cornelius Vanderbilt. Victoria Woodhull was, whatever else she became, no one's puppet. She would go on to preach free love from public stages to howls of outrage, to print in her own weekly the great scandal of the most famous preacher in America, and land in jail on an obscenity charge on the very day of the election she was contesting, and to stand as the first woman ever to seek the presidency of the United States. She had said, in her own words, that she had gone down to Wall Street to plant the flag of women's rebellion in the very center of the continent, and the Commodore's money had helped her plant it. All of that was still ahead of her. For now, she was simply the clairvoyant that the richest man in America could not do without. Now here is where a film that respects you owes you the truth beneath the séance, because the truth is stranger and better than the ghost story. Victoria Woodhull's stock tips did not come from the spirit world. They came from a woman named Josie Mansfield, who was the mistress of Vanderbilt's flamboyant rival, the speculator Jim Fisk. What Fisk let slip across a pillow, Mansfield carried to Woodhull, who dressed it in the language of the beyond and served it to the Commodore as prophecy. So the voice from the other side had a pulse, and it was breathing in Jim Fisk's bedroom. And yet leave the verdict exactly where honesty leaves it, which is open, because the old man may well have believed to his dying day that the spirits had simply chosen Josie Mansfield as the vessel to carry their message. That is the pattern this whole film turns upon. There is always a grounded explanation waiting underneath. There is almost never a way to prove that the grief was wrong to hope. The partnership did not last. In 1869, the Commodore married a young cousin named Frank Crawford, 4 decades his junior, and the new wife quietly closed the household against the two sisters. Woodhull herself soon turned on the great men of the age in print, Vanderbilt among them, writing that a man might amass $50 million from the labor of the country and be called one of the remarkable men of the age, while a starving child who took a single loaf of bread would be sent to prison. She marched off toward her own astonishing destiny, a campaign for the presidency of the United States in 1872, with the abolitionist Frederick Douglass named as her running mate whether he liked it or not. 2 years before, most of the country would even consider letting a woman cast a vote. But she left the old man exactly where she had found him, at the table, listening. He had used the mediums and kept his empire whole. His fortune had survived the séance. What his fortune could not survive, it turned out, was his own family, who had watched all of this from the edges of the lamplight and who had been keeping careful notes. Chapter 4. His children call him mad. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died at the start of 1877, His own children went into court to prove that the séance table had unseated his mind. He had died slowly, over months, in the house on Washington Place, and at the end his family had gathered around the bed and sung a hymn, and the old titan who had frightened a nation of businessmen had slipped away to the sound of it. Then the will was read, and the war began. The will was merciless. The Commodore had left almost the entire $100 million to a single son, William, the one he judged fit to run the railroads, with a further several million divided among William's own boys, and he had cut the rest of his many children down to comparative scraps, a few $100,000 here, the mere income on a trust there. His younger son, Cornelius Jeremiah, worn down by his debts and by the epilepsy that had shadowed his whole life, and two of the Commodore's daughters, rose up and contested the will in one of the longest and most sensational legal fights of the century, a trial that opened late in 1877 and ground on for something close to 8 months, emptying the family's most private secrets into the newspapers day after day, and the weapon the contestants reached for was the séance room. Their argument was simple and cruel, and aimed with real precision. The Commodore, their lawyer told the court, had been a believer in spiritualism, a man governed by its revelations, ruled by clairvoyance, who let the dead direct the disposition of the living. If they could persuade a court that a titan had been led by ghosts, they could break the will and redistribute the greatest fortune in America. Witness after witness was called to testify to what went on behind the curtains. One woman swore he had told her the spirit messages had cost him a great deal of money. Another testified that a message from beyond had instructed him to leave all his fortune to a single child, which was precisely, damningly, what he had done. Most striking of all, there was testimony that William himself, the favoured heir, had once paid a man to sit with the old Commodore and deliver a false message during a trance, a message from the beyond, urging that William be made the heir, and warning that the other children hated their father. Everyone, it seemed, had learned to speak in the voice of the dead once $100 million was in the room, listening. The spectacle spared no one and nothing. His 2 married daughters, who had joined the challenge, sat through months of their father's most private moments being read aloud to a packed courtroom. And when the physicians came to describe the body of the great man, they reported that nearly every organ in it had been ravaged by disease, save for one. His heart, they found, was unusually small. His enemies did not fail to notice the grim poetry of it. The richest man in America, and the smallest heart, and a fortune of $100 million that could not buy him back a single one of the dead. It did not, in the end, quite work. William's lawyers answered that a belief in spirits was no proof at all of madness. A former Chief Justice of the state rose to remind the court that thousands of intelligent and respectable people believed exactly the same thing, that there were supernatural elements in every religion under the sun, and that a man might consult a medium in the evening and run a railroad flawlessly the next morning. In the end, the will stood. But William, to buy silence and end the spectacle before it did more damage to the family name, settled with his brother rather than let it run its course, handing Cornelius Jeremiah an income drawn from a trust of some $600,000 he had been all but denied. It did the younger man little lasting good. 5 years later, still drowning in debt, disinherited in spirit, if not entirely in fact, Cornelius Jeremiah put a revolver to his own temple in a hotel room and died. The old Commodore had gone to the mediums to close the wound that his son George had torn in him, and another of his sons died by his own hand, in the wreckage of the fortune those same mediums had helped to shape. Vanderbilt had spent freely on the dead and kept his empire standing to the very last. The next believer we meet spent a fortune to prove the dead were really there, and his own money handed him the exact opposite of what he had paid for. Chapter 5. He paid to test his own faith. Henry Siebert believed in the spirits so completely that he left a fortune to have them examined. He is the quietest figure in this whole film, a Philadelphia gentleman of great inherited wealth and a distinguished name. His father had been a serious man of science, a chemist and mineralogist who assembled the first real mineral collection in the country, more than 1,700 crystals and stones, and who sat for a time in the Congress of the United States. Henry, orphaned of his entire family by his middle 20s, grew up rich, solitary, and haunted by absence, listed in the city directories by the single plain word, gentleman. He filled his empty life with two things, minerals and the dead. His Philadelphia house became known as a place of séances, and he took into it, for a time, none other than Maggie Fox herself, one of the two sisters whose childhood rappings had begun the whole movement 30 years before. She would later say, unkindly, that the old man was in the grip of what she called pure religious insanity. But Siebert wanted more than the comfort of a message. He wanted certainty. He was that rarest of believers, one who genuinely wished to know whether the thing he loved was true. And, almost alone among the people in this film, he had the humility to fear that it might not be. In his will, he left the University of Pennsylvania $60,000 to endow a chair of philosophy named in his own father's honor, on a single extraordinary condition. The university had to appoint a commission of serious and skeptical men to investigate modern spiritualism honestly and rigorously, and to report exactly what they found, wherever the trail led. A devout spiritualist was reaching out from beyond his own grave to fund the trial of his own faith. He was so certain of the door that he paid to have it taken off its hinges and inspected in daylight. The commission that formed was formidable, chaired by a great literary scholar and stocked with physicians and men of science. Among them, one of the most respected doctors in the country. And it went to work in the middle 1880s, with the celebrated mediums of the day paraded one by one before it. What it found, in case after case, was fraud, or the strong and settled suspicion of it. The most famous slate-writing medium of the age, a man named Henry Slade, whose specialty was messages from the dead appearing between two sealed slates, and who had already been prosecuted for fraud across the ocean in London, was watched with cold attention. The commissioners concluded that his work was, in their exact word, fraudulent throughout, produced by nothing grander than what they called elementary tricks of legerdemain, the slate drawn quietly out and glanced at and slipped back while the sitters looked away. They caught another medium freeing his arm in the dark to move the instruments a spirit was said to be playing. They noted, dryly, that in an age of double exposure, photography, it was worse than childish to claim a spiritual source for a picture that any amateur in the art could produce at will. The men who did the looking were not cranks or enemies of the faith. They were among the most respected minds in the country, a famous scholar of Shakespeare in the chair, the provost of the university, a great physician and writer of the age, and they went at the question with real care, sitting through séance after séance in good faith. They caught a second medium quietly freeing his arm in the dark to move the instruments that a spirit was supposed to be playing. They watched the rappings that had begun the whole movement and concluded that such sounds could be produced by nothing more mysterious than the voluntary working of the muscles and joints of the human body. In 3 long years of patient looking, they reported, not one genuinely new fact had emerged. Henry Siebert had spent an endowment to open the door and prove there was something waiting on the other side, and his own money, gently and devastatingly, had shown him an empty room. The chair he founded still stands at the university to this day. So does the great bell he gave to hang in the tower of Independence Hall, a bell cast partly from old cannon that rings out clear over the city and has never once cracked. He left the country monuments that endure and got for himself only the truth. He lost his illusions and the price of a professor's chair. The next believer would put his faith to no such test, and he would lose his house. Chapter 6. The Lawyer and the Painted Ghosts. Luther Marsh had trained in the office of Daniel Webster, and in his grief he came to believe that dead masters were painting him pictures. He was, by every measure the world uses, a man who should have known better. He was past 70, a distinguished New York lawyer who had studied at the side of the greatest advocate of the age, the man whose voice had held the Senate spellbound for a generation. He had served as a commissioner of the city's parks. He was wealthy, respected, and known in his later years for public lectures on Webster and on the spirits, a fixture of the better drawing rooms. And he was a widower who had also buried a young daughter. And that is the fact that unlocks all the rest, because Luther Marsh did not come to the séance table out of stupidity. He came the way they all came, through a small grave, looking for a door. He wanted, more than anything the law had ever given him, to hear his wife and his child again, and to know they were safe on the other side. The woman who opened the door for him called herself, among some 30 other names she used across her long career, Anne Odelia Dis DeBar. She had been born plain Editha Salomon in Kentucky, the daughter of a music teacher, and she had reinvented herself so many times that the truth of her was almost lost even to her. She claimed to be the illegitimate child of the famous dancer Lola Montez and a mad Bavarian king, and styled herself a princess, a countess, a baroness, whatever the mark in front of her seemed to require. Her own brother described her with a chill that has never been improved upon. Wherever she enters a house, he said, peace departs, and with it, everything portable. What she offered Marsh was the most seductive thing a grieving lover of art could possibly imagine. The spirits of the old masters themselves, she told him, would paint for him from beyond the grave. In her séances, the sitters were handed blank canvases, and during the ceremony those canvases would fill, as if by no mortal hand, with pictures out of the beyond. Raphael sent images. Rembrandt sent a canvas that arrived, obligingly, on Christmas Day. There came a portrait of Alexander the Great, said to be the work of Apelles, the court painter who had worked from the living Alexander more than 2,000 years before. There came a portrait of Marsh himself, delivered, she explained, by Rembrandt, and passed along through Raphael as an intermediary, as though the dead ran a courier service between the studios of heaven. The old lawyer gathered up some 75 of these spirit paintings and 3 thick notebooks of messages from the dead, from Peter and from Paul and from the saints, and he is said to have bought a great block of Italian marble in the sincere hope that the spirit of the sculptor Phidias would consent to carve it for him. And still the deliveries came, week after week. Messages arrived in the notebooks from Peter and from Paul, dictated, she said, through her body from the world beyond, and Marsh copied them all down faithfully, as fast as her voice would carry them. It was one of these, a message from the Apostle Peter that had supposedly taken a full quarter of an hour to arrive from heaven, yet filled only a line or two upon the page, that would one day help to undo her in open court. But in the parlour, in the lamplight, with a grieving old man leaning forward across the table, none of it seemed absurd at all. It seemed like heaven itself, taking an interest in him at last. Anyone who looked at the paintings with a clear eye could see they were poor things, second-rate copies. And worse than that, They had plainly been traced from the engravings and photographs in Marsh's own library. The old masters, it seemed, had been reduced to plagiarizing his bookshelf. But Marsh did not look with a clear eye. He looked with a father's eye and a widower's eye, and he saw the gates of heaven standing open in his own parlour. And so Disdebar asked him for the thing that turns this from a private sorrow into one of the great public scandals of the age. She persuaded him to sign over his home, the marble mansion at 166 Madison Avenue, a house worth some $60,000, which she promptly rechristened a Temple of Truth. And the very moment the deed was safely in her hands, she mortgaged the house for $11,000 in hard cash. A grieving old man had given away his home for a stack of forged Rembrandts, and a swindler had turned it into money at the bank inside a week. It was that mortgage, that cold conversion of a father's longing into $11,000, that finally moved his alarmed friends to act and to drag the whole strange business into the open light of a courtroom. Chapter 7. A wet sponge breaks the spell. In open court, a chemist wiped a wet sponge across a sheet of blank paper, and a human face rose slowly up out of the nothing. This was the undoing of Anne Odelia Disdebar, and it remains one of the strangest courtroom scenes the century ever produced. Marsh himself would not bring the case, for he still believed to the marrow. It was his friends and fellow lawyers, alarmed at the mortgage swallowing his house, who acted, retaining a famously ruthless firm of criminal lawyers to prosecute her privately for a conspiracy to defraud. She was arrested in the spring of 1888, along with a man who passed as her husband and a pair of hangers-on who were later acquitted, guilty of nothing worse than eating well at Marsh's table. And the trial that followed became a national sensation because the prosecution did not merely argue that her miracles were fake. They performed them, one by one, in front of the jury. The case was a private prosecution, brought not by the city's district attorney, but by Marsh's own alarmed circle, who had hired a pair of the most feared criminal lawyers in New York to do the one thing Marsh himself would never do, which was to turn on the woman he still called his friend. It came before a police justice, and then a jury, and from the very first day it drew crowds into the courtroom, because word had gone round the city that the prosecution meant not to describe her miracles, but to reproduce them, there in the room, in front of everyone. And so, one after another, they did. A handwriting and photographic expert named David Carvalho took the stand and explained the trick of the precipitated paintings. The canvases and the papers had been treated in advance with the very chemicals a photographer uses to develop an image, so that a picture already lying invisible on the surface would bloom slowly into view at the first touch of moisture. Then he showed them. He drew a wet sponge across a sheet of apparently virgin paper held up before the court, and a clear, finished portrait of a famous actress appeared, where a moment before there had been nothing at all. It is, he told them evenly, merely a chemical change. A celebrated stage magician named Heiress did the same service for her spirit writing, folding a blank sheet and producing on it, before the astonished courtroom, a written message addressed to Marsh, to the deep and visible red of Madame Disdebar's face. Years later, Hertz would confess something extraordinary to the great Houdini himself, in a letter Houdini printed in a book. To be absolutely certain of convicting her, Hertz admitted, he had cheated in that very courtroom, palming a prepared slip of paper rather than honestly reproducing her method. The great fraud had been broken, in part, by a quiet counter-fraud, a magician's honest lie set against a swindler's dishonest one. And when the prosecutor mocked a message from the Apostle Peter that had supposedly taken 15 minutes to arrive from heaven, yet had somehow been written down in 2, he drew a line that outlived the whole affair. Peter, he observed, was a lively scribbler. she was convicted and sentenced to 6 months on Blackwell's Island, and she stood by her powers even as they were dismantled around her, telling the court that she rested her honor upon its all being done by spiritual power. She had warned the newspapers, before it all began, that she could be a very charming woman, or she could be a Lady Macbeth. She went on afterward to a long career of fraud across 2 continents, through a prison term in Illinois under one name and a far longer one in London under another, for a squalid affair at a temple there that sent her away for 7 years. Then, paroled, she slipped the net of Scotland Yard and vanished from the record altogether, surfacing once or twice under new names in one American city or another, before disappearing for good, presumed dead by the 1930s, her real ending as unknown as her real beginning. Houdini called her one of the most extraordinary fake mediums and swindlers the world had ever known. And Luther Marsh. The verdict did not shake his faith in the spirits in the least. It shook only his trust in her as a person, and even that not entirely, for a New York newspaper on Christmas Day of 1888 ran the headline that he was still her friend. His stated grievance, on the rare occasions he voiced one, was not that she had stripped him of a fortune and his home. It was that she and her supposed husband had turned out never to have been married at all. He kept his belief until he died, an old man lecturing on Daniel Webster and on the spirits, while the forged paintings sat impounded in a police storeroom and hang to this day on the wall of a little museum in a spiritualist town in the far west of New York State. A grieving man's longing, printed in developer chemicals. Marsh had given a house and kept the faith. The next believer would give nearly 2 decades and a fortune, and would go to her grave never learning the truth at all. Chapter 8. The Widow and the Divine Fire. Clara Bloomfield Moore called John Keeley a modern Prometheus, and she spent a fortune to keep his fire burning. She is the figure in this film hardest to pity from a safe distance, because she was nobody's fool. A widow of a great paper manufacturing fortune, she was also a celebrated author in her own right, whose book on the etiquette of good society was for a time the most quoted work of its kind in America. A clever, cultivated, formidable woman who moved between Philadelphia and London and corresponded with the famous of 2 continents. And in 1881, she met a former carpenter from Philadelphia named John Keeley, who claimed to have discovered a wholly new force in nature, and she gave the rest of her life to him and to it. Keeley was not a medium, and it is only fair to him and to you to say so plainly, because the honesty of this whole film depends on the distinction. He held no séances and summoned up no dead. What he claimed was stranger and more modern, and in its way more seductive than any ghost. He said he had learned to unlock a hidden power sleeping inside ordinary water and air, a force he called by a dozen shifting names, an etheric vapor, a vibratory sympathy, a sympathetic vibratory physics. A few drops of water, he promised, held power enough to move the world. A single quart of it, he claimed, could drive a train from Philadelphia to San Francisco and back again. In his workshop, before carefully chosen audiences, machines he called generators and liberators shuddered and howled and spun, and he swore they produced pressures no boiler on earth could match. Thousands of pounds to the square inch, drawn from a few gallons of tap water trembling at the right unseen frequency. His company had been capitalized on paper at $5 million and had taken in perhaps $1 million from hopeful investors. And across 26 years, it produced not one working product and paid not one dividend. Yet the money kept flowing, because a man named Keeley had learned to make wonder look exactly like science, and because a great lady stood behind him and swore that it was real. Hard-headed men of business bought into it too for a time, the company drew perhaps $1 million out of investors in New York and Philadelphia, who wanted to believe that a poor Philadelphia mechanic had stumbled onto a power that would make coal and steam obsolete and remake the wealth of the world. Year after year, the demonstrations came, and year after year, the finished engine that would remake the world was forever almost ready and never quite arrived. A friend claimed that Keeley, asked once what words he wanted carved on his stone, had answered that he was the greatest humbug of the century. Whether he ever truly said it, the line has the ring of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, but it was not the hard-headed investors who mattered most to him. It was the great lady. For what Clara Bloomfield Moore brought him was belief and money and the language that lifted a mechanic's fraud clean into a religion. She poured more than $100,000 into him over the years, along with a monthly allowance to keep him and his workshop and his household alive. And when the doubters closed in around him, she answered them in print, in articles, and in a whole admiring book about his discoveries. She invited the two greatest electrical minds of the age, Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, to come and examine the machine, and both of them declined. A learned professor who did examine it declared to a scientific institute that Keeley had demonstrated to him, beyond all question, the existence of a force hitherto unknown, and then quietly retreated from that endorsement when Keeley refused to let a single suspicious wire be cut and tested. And Clara wrote of Keeley in language that lifts the whole affair out of engineering and into scripture. His work, she wrote, was not the airy fabric of delusion, nor the baser fabric of a fraud. He had scaled the rocks that barricade earth from heaven, and he knew that the fire he had brought down with him was divine. The universal ether that filled his machine was, she wrote, the tangible link between God and man. It was, in every way but the furniture, a séance. She had not come to hear a dead voice at a table. She had come to lay her hand upon the divine through a machine in a Philadelphia workshop, and she paid and paid and paid for the better part of 20 years. Chapter 9. What was in the cellar? She died in London, still certain, and 2 weeks later her own son stood in a Philadelphia cellar and watched the workmen tear open the floor. That is the shape of it, and the timing is almost too cruel to speak aloud. By the end, her devotion to Keeley had cost her far more than money. It had cost her her family. Her son, Clarence, who would find himself short tens of thousands of dollars in his own inheritance because of Keeley and his endless promises, had come to see the mystic for the thief he plainly was, and the long, bitter quarrel over the money opened a wound between mother and son that never fully closed in her lifetime. She went to London, and she died there in the first days of 1899, having never once, through all of it, stopped believing that the fire in the machine was divine. John Keeley himself had died a few weeks before her, at the very end of 1898, taking his secret, so his followers hoped, with him to the grave. And with both the mystic and his great patron gone, the men who had doubted him for years finally got inside the sealed workshop. And what they found there is the coldest, cleanest, grounded explanation in this entire film. A team of engineers and scientists from the university in Philadelphia, with Clara's own son, Clarence, present to watch it done with his own eyes, pulled up the floors and broke open the walls of the laboratory where all the wonders had been performed. Beneath the demonstration room, 2 full floors down, they found a silent water motor. In the cellar below even that, they found a hollow iron sphere weighing 3 tons, an enormous hidden reservoir of compressed air. And running up through the beams and the walls and beneath the very floorboards where visitors had stood open-mouthed in awe, they found the concealed tubes and valves and switches that had carried that compressed air, invisibly, to the trembling machines above. The divine fire that could move the world with a cup of water was 3 tons of ordinary compressed air in the basement, fed up through hidden pipes to the trembling machines above. One of the engineers concluded, in a signed and public statement, that Keeley had probably lied and deceived from the very beginning. Clara Bloomfield Moore had spent a fortune and her son's trust and the last 2 decades of her life on a tank in a cellar. The only mercy in the whole affair, if mercy is even the word, is that she died 2 short weeks too soon to see the great sphere hauled up out of the dark and into the daylight. Think of what she had actually purchased with those 20 years. Not a machine, for there was no machine, only a shell of one with a tank beneath it. Not the divine link she had written about with such conviction, for there was nothing on the far side of the workshop wall but hidden tubes and a tank of compressed air. She had bought a story, a beautiful and elevating story about earth and heaven and a fire brought down for mankind, and she had paid for it with her money and her name and her only son's regard, and she had believed it to the last hour of her life. That may, in the end, be the gentlest fate of anyone in this film. She never had to watch her faith break. The men in the cellar broke it for her, a fortnight too late for it to reach her. She left her fine collection of art to a museum and endowed a fund meant to give women a fair chance in the sciences, so that some good outlived the folly. But the lesson of her sits heavier than any of it. Every believer so far in this film had trusted a real, living person, a medium or a mystic, who sat across a table from them and looked them in the eye and took their money by hand. The most famous believer of them all trusted no living person at all, only a story the whole world told her about herself. And very nearly everything you have ever been told about Sarah Winchester is untrue. Chapter 10. The Heiress, the Guns Made Rich. Sarah Winchester buried her only child in a matter of weeks, and then, 15 years later, she buried her husband, and out of that double silence, the country built its favourite ghost story. Her fortune came from rifles. Her husband was William Winchester, the only son of Oliver Winchester, whose repeating rifle, the model of 1873, became so central to the taking of the Western Plains that it was remembered ever after as the gun that won the West. More than 8 million of them would eventually be sold across the world. The Winchester name meant firepower, and firepower in that age meant an ocean of money, and Sarah, a bright and musical young woman from New Haven, fluent in several languages and barely 5 feet tall, married into the whole of it in 1862. The scale of what she had married into is hard to hold in the mind. Oliver Winchester, a shirt manufacturer, had taken over a failing rifle firm and remade it into the most famous gunworks in the world, and the rifles poured out of New Haven by the hundreds of thousands and then the millions, arming soldiers and settlers and lawmen and outlaws across a whole expanding continent. Each rifle was only a few dollars. The few dollars became a river, and the river ran without pause to the family that owned the company, and Sarah, married to the only son and heir, stood at the very head of it as a young woman. She would want for nothing material for the rest of her natural life. It is the oldest and cruelest arrangement in this whole film. The fortune arrived, in full, and then the reasons to enjoy it were taken away, one by one. Then came the wounds, and they were terrible, beyond the ordinary run of grief. In the summer of 1866, she had a daughter, Annie, and the child sickened almost at once with a wasting condition that let her take no nourishment at all, so that she simply faded, week by week, and died within little more than a month of her birth, a newborn starving in her mother's arms, while a fortune in rifle money sat helpless in the bank. Sarah would never have another child. 15 years later, in the winter of 1881, her husband William died of tuberculosis, the slow consumption that hollowed out so many of the age, and his father Oliver had died only months before him, so that within a single cruel span, the whole vast fortune came to rest upon a single grieving widow, with no living child, and no one left inside the great empty house to share any of it. She had money enough, in time, to do very nearly anything a human being could do with money. She had none at all of the two things she actually wanted. She drew inward after that, into a privacy so complete that it became a kind of blank canvas for other people's imaginations. She gave no interviews. She sat for almost no photographs. She kept her own counsel and her own grief, and left almost nothing behind in her own words, so that when the storytellers came for her, decades on, there was nobody left to say what she had really felt or really believed. A silent, veiled, immensely rich widow, building without pause, is exactly the kind of figure a legend loves, because she cannot argue back. And so a legend came. Here the legend takes over, and you have almost certainly heard some version of it told in the dark. The story goes that Sarah, unhinged by grief and by wealth, sought out a famous medium in Boston, and that the medium told her a terrible and specific thing. The spirits of all the many thousands of people killed the world over by Winchester rifles were gathering against her, seeking vengeance for their deaths, and they had laid a curse upon her family, which had already taken her baby and her husband. Only one course could save her now. She must build a house for herself and for all those angry dead, and she must never, ever stop building it. To let the hammers fall silent even for a night, the medium warned, was to die. And so, the story goes, Sarah fled clear across the country to California, and there raised a vast and monstrous mansion that grew and sprawled and doubled back upon itself for the entire rest of her natural life. A house of 160 rooms, with staircases that climbed straight into ceilings and doors that opened onto empty air, all of it built to shelter her from the vengeance of the rifle dead. It is a magnificent story. It has sold a very great many tickets, and almost none of it is true. Chapter 11. The House That Never Stopped. She bought an unfinished farmhouse and did not stop building it for the rest of her life. Some years after her husband died, Sarah Winchester left the grief of New Haven behind her and traveled west to the mild valleys south of San Francisco. And in 1886, she bought an unfinished 8-room farmhouse and the land around it for a little over $12,000. She gave the place a name, and then she began to build, and she did not truly stop for the better part of 40 years. Carpenters came and stayed for whole careers, generation handing the work to generation. Rooms multiplied into the dozens and then past 100. Wings rose and were torn down and rose again in another shape. Towers climbed. Balconies looked out over other roofs of the very same house. By the end, the place sprawled across acres in a great restless pile that no single mind had ever planned out on paper, 7 stories high before the earth intervened. And out of that endless, patternless building, the legend of the cursed spirit house was born whole. But walk slowly through the real history of the place, and the strangeness dissolves, room by room, into a series of quiet, human explanations. Yes, there are staircases that climb toward a ceiling and simply stop, and doors on an upper floor that open onto a sudden drop into the garden below. The likeliest reason is not a vengeful spirit, but a single morning in the spring of 1906, when the great earthquake that leveled much of San Francisco reached down the peninsula and tore the top floors and the tower clean off the Winchester house. Sarah herself was said to have been briefly trapped in her own bedroom in the shaking, and rather than rebuild the ruin above her, she simply had the damaged upper rooms sealed and boarded away and left them. And so a door that once opened into a bedroom now opens onto nothing but the air. Other oddities came from the sheer manner of the building itself. When you bolt wing after wing onto a house for 40 years, a window that once looked out over the garden ends up staring into the wall of a new room, and a door that once led to the outside ends up leading into a cupboard or nowhere at all. There was never a trained architect on the place. There was only Sarah, standing over her own rough plans across 4 decades, changing her mind, tearing out what displeased her, and beginning again on a whim. The numbers people repeat about the house have the same swollen sales floor quality as the numbers repeated about her fortune. 160 rooms, they say, and 2,000 doors, and 10,000 windows, and 47 staircases, and 13 bathrooms. All of it precise. All of it a little too neat. The truth is that the house was never finished and never truly counted in her lifetime, and the tidy figures were arrived at afterward by the people selling the tour. What is real is stranger than any inventory. The place genuinely rambled without plan or symmetry, genuinely turned back upon itself, genuinely rose and fell as her whims and her means, and the wounded ground itself dictated across 4 decades of nearly unbroken work. Even the single most famous feature of the whole house carries a tender and ordinary root. There is a staircase in it that rises in absurd little steps, dozens upon dozens of them, gaining only a few feet of height as it doubles back and forth on itself like a switchback on a mountain road. The legend calls it a clever device to confuse the vengeful spirits. The likely truth is far gentler and far sadder. Sarah Winchester suffered badly from arthritis. Her hands and her joints stiffened and swollen and full of pain, and a staircase that rose only an inch or 2 at a time was a staircase that an aching, aging woman could still manage to climb on her own. The house that the whole country now reads as a map of a broken mind reads just as easily, and a great deal more truly, as the long, improvised private project of a rich and lonely and grieving woman with failing hands and nothing left in all the world but time and money and the memory of 2 graves. And there, walking those strange corridors, we come at last to the doors that open onto empty air, and we ought to stop and stand in front of one of them, because it is the truest single image in this entire film. A door in a great house that opens onto nothing at all. That is what grief is. That is the thing every one of these people stood before. And in Sarah Winchester's case, the most famous haunted case of them all, the one thing genuinely missing from the whole ghost story is the ghost. Chapter 12. The Medium Who Never Was. The Boston medium who supposedly told Sarah Winchester to build has a name, and the name has a birthday, and the birthday falls squarely in the 20th century. In the story, that name is Adam Coons, and he does not appear in any record from Sarah's own lifetime at all. Not one. He surfaces for the very first time in a book about American ghosts published in 1967, 45 years after Sarah was already in her grave. Historians who have gone hunting for the famous Boston medium she is said to have consulted have found no trace of any such person practicing anywhere in Boston, no advertisement, no notice, no name in any city directory, nothing at all. The most careful modern biography of Sarah Winchester, the patient work of a historian who spent years in the archives following every thread to its end, searched for any evidence whatsoever of séances or mediums at the house, and could not document a single one. Pull the thread, and the whole rich tapestry comes quietly apart in your hands. The famous séance room, where Sarah was said to commune with the angry dead every midnight, turns out in the household records to have been the bedroom of her gardener, an ordinary room where a member of her staff actually slept. The idea that she was forbidden ever to stop building on pain of her own death is contradicted flatly by the plain fact that the building started and halted many times over the decades, and by Sarah's own words, in her own hand, in a surviving letter, where she writes of growing worn and tired and dismissing all the workmen for a while so that she herself might rest. The obsessive pattern of the number 13, said to be woven all through the house, the 13 bathrooms and the 13 windows in a room and the 13 hooks in a closet, was very largely stitched into the story after her death, added by the people who bought the property and needed a good hook to sell tickets. And that, in the end, is where the whole ghost story truly comes from. Sarah Winchester died quietly in her sleep in 1922, past 80 years old, and within a single year the house had been leased and thrown open to the paying public as an attraction. And the woman who opened it understood, as all showmen understand, that a curse sells a great deal better at the gate than an arthritic widow with a hammer and a broken heart. It was she who first spun the tale of the vengeful rifle spirits for the visitors, and when the great Houdini himself came out to see the place 2 years later, the name Mystery House was fixed to it forever. Everyone who came afterward added another coat of paint. A famous newspaper feature that traded in the odd and the unbelievable put the house before millions of readers. A carpenter is said to have gone through the rooms in later years and quietly added the 13 coat hooks in a closet and the other little multiples of 13 that the guides now point to as proof of a dead woman's obsession. And in our own century, a motion picture dressed a great actress in Sarah's black veil and sold the curse all over again to a new generation, until the invented Sarah, haunted and guilt-struck and ruled by a medium's command, had all but buried the real one. The legend now weighs so much more than the woman ever did that it takes a deliberate act of excavation to find her underneath it at all. So strip all of it away, gently, and look hard at what is left standing. Because the woman underneath the legend deserves at least that much honesty from us. The people who actually knew Sarah Winchester called her sane, clear-headed, kind, and remarkably shrewd with her own money. One neighbour said flatly that she was as sane and clear-headed a woman as he had ever known. She paid her workmen well, far above the going rate for the valley, and she remembered a good many of them by name in her will. And out of the fortune that the legend forever fixates upon, the $20 million and the $1,000 a day that were always far more advertising than fact, for her true estate at her death came to only a few million. She quietly did one thing that tells you exactly who she really was underneath. She built and endowed a hospital back in New Haven for the sufferers of tuberculosis, the very disease that had taken her young husband from her, and she gave the hospital his name. Look at the real ledger, and even the money turns human and small. She did not wake one morning holding $20 million. On her husband's death, she came into a few $1,000s in cash and a block of shares in the rifle company, and across the long years that followed, as the company prospered and more stock came to her hands, the fortune grew slowly, until at her death, her whole estate was appraised at a few $1,000,000. A great sum, certainly, but never the bottomless ocean of gold the legend needs in order to explain 160 rooms. What built those rooms was time and grief, far more than it was gold. That is the real Sarah Winchester. A woman who had buried a baby daughter and a young husband, and who filled the enormous, silent decades that came afterward with the one occupation that grief can never, ever finish. The strangeness of the house is entirely real. The earthquake was real, and the 40 years of building and the aching hands on the low, shallow stairs. The haunting was manufactured later for the gate receipts, and the grief was as true as grief has ever been in this world. Take the spirits out of her story, and out of every single story in this film, and the same thing is always left standing there in the ruins. Chapter 13. What the mediums left standing. The paintings still hang, the house still stands, the great iron sphere is long gone, and the grief has outlasted every one of them. That is the strange thing about walking through the wreckage of these fortunes now, more than a century on. The monuments to the delusion survive, and even thrive, while the human ache that first raised them has faded into a footnote that almost nobody reads. In a quiet spiritualist village in the far west of New York State, the forged spirit paintings that cost Luther Marsh his mansion still hang on a museum wall, admired by visitors, their old fraud softened by the years into a harmless curiosity. In California, the Winchester House draws its crowds year upon year, and the very legend that was invented to sell it, the curse and the nightly séances and the vengeful rifle dead, is the exact product printed on the tickets at the gate. At the University of Pennsylvania, the chair of philosophy that Henry Siebert paid for still exists, still carries his father's honored name, a monument to a believer whose own money proved his cherished faith an empty room. And the greatest irony of all belongs to the Commodore, whose séances have been buried so thoroughly beneath the railroads and the great university that carries his name that most of the students who pass through it today have no idea the old man ever sat in a dark room waiting for his mother to speak to him. It reached the humblest parlors and the highest offices in the land alike. A grieving First Lady filled the private rooms of the White House with mediums after a fever took her little boy. Serious men of science, chemists and naturalists, whose names still sit in the schoolbooks, sat down at tables in the dark and rose up believers. The Boston photographer, who sold the shadow of a murdered president to that same widow, was hauled into court for fraud, with the great showman Barnum himself testifying against him, and he walked out a free man, because a jury could not be entirely sure. Belief spread that wide is not the weakness of a few soft minds. It is the shape of a whole grieving century. And it should be said plainly, so that no one mistakes these five for fools set apart from the rest of their world, that the grief reached the very summit of American society, again and again. When the railroad king Leland Stanford and his wife lost their only son to fever at 15, they too sat at séance tables in their mourning, in Paris and in New York and in San Francisco, before they poured their fortune into a great university built in the boy's name. Edith Rockefeller, a daughter of the richest family the country had ever produced, married into another fortune and came to believe, in all seriousness, that she had once lived as the child bride of a pharaoh of Egypt. This was not the weakness of a few strange individuals. It was the water the whole age swam in. The fortunes raised these monuments, and the fortunes themselves are long gone, and the buildings and the paintings and the endowed chairs remain, emptied of the feeling that once filled them to the brim. And the marketplace at the very heart of it all has never once closed its doors. It has only changed its furniture. The séance table became the mystic's humming workshop, and the workshop has become 100 other things in the century since. But the transaction at the center of it is precisely the same transaction that emptied Luther Marsh's house and drained Clara Bloomfield Moore's purse. Somewhere, always, there is a person with money and a grave they cannot fill. And somewhere, always, there is a figure waiting in the doorway with a candle and a price. The names change with the decades. The furniture changes. The door does not. Chapter 14. The ghost was grief. Return, at the very last, to the curtained room on Washington Place, and to the old man at the little table, waiting for a voice he owned everything on earth except. Cornelius Vanderbilt sat there because his mother was gone and his chosen son was gone, and no railroad and no fortune, however vast, could carry a single word across to them in the dark. And once you have truly seen him there, you have seen all of them, because they were, every one of them, in the end, sitting at that same small table. Vanderbilt had wanted his mother. Henry Siebert had wanted proof that the door was real. Luther Marsh had wanted his wife and his lost little girl. Clara Bloomfield Moore had wanted to lay her hand upon the divine. And Sarah Winchester, who never sat at a single séance in her whole life, had wanted her baby and her husband back so fiercely that a whole nation went and invented a haunted house just to explain the sheer size of her sorrow. They were the richest people in America, and this is the one thing that all of their money could not do. It could raise marble palaces and endow great universities, corner the gold market, and buy the silence of a courtroom, and it could not open the single door that every human being who has ever lived eventually comes to stand before. And so they paid the people who promised to open it for them. Those people, the mediums and the mystics and the swindlers, were not devils, most of them, and they were not geniuses. They were simply the ones who had understood the deepest truth of the whole age of the great fortunes, which is that a grieving heart with a full purse is the most faithful customer in all the world. Think of yourself, for just a moment, in that shuttered room. The person you love most in the world is standing just on the other side of a door that you cannot open. You have a fortune sitting in your hand, and a soft, kind, certain voice is telling you that it can be done, that the door can be opened for a price. Ask yourself, honestly, what you would pay. That is the whole of it, right there. That is why the hardest man in America wept in a dark room, and why a brilliant author gave 20 years to a tank in a cellar, and why a great and learned lawyer signed away his family home for a stack of forged Rembrandts. The Commodore said once that he had been insane on the subject of money making all his life, and he meant it as a boast, the war cry of a man who had beaten everyone he had ever faced across a table. But turn the sentence over and hold it up against the shuttered room and the small séance table, and the boast becomes a confession. The man who was insane on the subject of money was, at the very end of it all, only a son who wanted his mother, and every last dollar he had ever wrung out of the world could not buy him one more word with her. The ghost in every one of these great fortunes was never a spirit. The ghost was grief, and it always had been, and the mediums were only the ones who learned to stand in the doorway and charge admission. And the door, in the strangest house that any of them ever built, still swings open, to this very day, onto nothing at all. If these are the kinds of stories you want more of, the glamour and the grief and the strange places where the two of them meet, then subscribe and stay with me, because I have a great many more of them left to tell. And before you go, tell me down in the comments which of these 5 you would have believed if the person you loved most in the world were standing just on the other side of that door, and you had the money and the sorrow to keep it open.